It was bad for Bill and Nancy to have to die the way they did. But for a 7-year-old girl to die that way, to be wrapped with plastic, to be wrapped with duct tape, to have a 60-pound rock strapped to her body and thrown into a lake, there was no excuse.
Killing an entire family is already a horrifying act, but to torture a child while her parents helplessly watched? That's pure evil beyond anything words can capture. This became the burning drive for the whole Pope County Sheriff's Office in Arkansas back in 1996. What started as an unthinkable, brutal crime would soon pull back the curtain on an even darker web of secrets, all tied to one terrifying thing: white supremacy. No doubt about it, this is one of the most disturbing and ruthless cases we've ever covered on this channel. And it leaves you with one huge question. How does a mindset this twisted spiral into such heartless violence? Now, before we try to answer that, let's take a closer look at the victims, the Muller family. For starters, the Mullers weren't just any ordinary family. They were gun enthusiasts, a lifestyle that defined much of their world. The father, William Muller, wasn't just a passionate collector. He was a federal firearms licensee, meaning he was a licensed gun dealer. He also worked as a self-employed electrician, and his life revolved around guns, selling them, buying them, and even using them. He was married to Nancy, and together they raised their 8-year-old daughter, Sarah, their only child. They loved her with all their hearts, and she was the center of their world. The family lived in Tilly, Arkansas, a small, tight-knit community where William and Nancy homeschooled Sarah. Weekends were often spent at gun shows, a shared hobby that only brought them closer together as a family. Given this, it's no surprise that their home was packed to the brim with firearms, ammunition, and a hefty stash of cash. With all that valuable loot just sitting there, it made the perfect target for a robbery. And that's exactly what happened in 1995. The Muller home was broken into by a man named Kirby Kehoe, who, shockingly, was a family friend. He stole guns and cash, but instead of letting this setback shake them, the Muller family didn't miss a beat. The robbery didn't stop their passion for firearms or their business. Now, keep this robbery in mind because it's going to be crucial in the investigation that unfolds later. Fast forward to January of 1996. The Muller family was out of the house, probably spending some quality, relaxed time together. But little did they know, waiting in the shadows of their home were two monsters, ready to strike the moment they walked through the door. As soon as they entered, the Mullers were confronted by these two men. They were dressed like FBI agents, but don't be fooled. These guys weren't the real deal. They were imposters. Without wasting a second, they tied the family to chairs, and when William Muller, who was 52 years old at that time, refused to cooperate, things took a terrifying turn. The intruders separated the family, and they began to torture them while interrogating. They did everything in their power to force the Mullers to talk. But when the parents still didn't give in, they turned their attention to the 8-year-old Sarah. This is where it gets absolutely chilling. Sarah was interrogated about the family's fortune, about where they kept their money and valuables. And to make her talk, one of the men shocked her with an electric cattle prod. While this isn't enough to kill a person, the pain is excruciating, especially for a young child like Sarah. After the little girl gave them the information they were after, they found $50,000 in cash, along with guns and ammunition. Now, you might think they'd just grab what they came for and leave, but that's not how it went. The nightmare was far from over. The Mullers were then subdued with stun guns, which knocked them unconscious. The intruders took their sweet time with this, almost like they were enjoying the slow, agonizing process. But it didn't stop there. The worst was yet to come. The two men suffocated them by placing sealed plastic bags over their heads. Imagine the horror of knowing your entire family is being tortured, helpless, and unable to stop it. That's the reality the Mullers were facing in those final moments. Now, if you thought the Mullers were found dead right after that horrifying night, well, you'd be wrong. The truth is, 2 weeks passed before anyone realized something was horribly wrong. Nancy Muller's mom, Earlene Branch, hadn't heard a word from her daughter in all that time. That was totally unlike Nancy. She always called after their trips, especially when they went to those gun shows. So Earlene couldn't shake that gut feeling something bad had happened. She reached out to the sheriff, sharing her growing concern. Sheriff Jay Winters knew the Mullers, even though they lived in a neighboring county, and he agreed to help. But when he spoke to people in the neighborhood, they didn't seem worried at all. Most people figured the Mullers had just taken off somewhere, maybe a quick trip or a break from everything, and hadn't bothered to check in. It almost felt like everyone thought they were just giving themselves some space, and everything was fine. Then, on February 11th, an entire month later, the case took a terrifying turn. A farmer just going about his day found the Mullers' Jeep. It was hidden, abandoned on the side of the highway, far from where it should have been. This discovery set the investigation into motion again. Inside the Jeep was Nancy Muller's purse, and it still held her wallet and ID. But the trailer was empty, with no sign of the family anywhere. As days turned into weeks, weeks into months, the Mullers' disappearance became even more unsettling. No leads, no clues, just the eerie silence of their absence. Then, 5 months later, a twist in the case came when an elderly couple decided to spend a day fishing in a bayou near Russellville. While waiting for a bite, the woman snagged her fishing line on something, and when she tried to free it, she quickly realized she had hooked a boot that still held the bone of a man's leg inside it. Horrified, she cut the line and rushed for help. This set off another search, led by Sheriff Winters, who organized teams to scour the bayou with metal hooks and divers. By the end of the day, they had recovered parts of a body. The torso was weighed down by a rock, and the head was wrapped in duct tape. From the moment investigators saw the body, they knew this wasn't some ordinary crime. It looked like an execution, deliberate, cold, and calculated. The body was that of a small female, and at first investigators thought it could be the body of a 6-year-old girl who had been reported missing from a nearby county the year before. But when they examined the size and the clothing, it didn't match. That's when they started to wonder, could this be Sarah Muller? The next day, 2 more partial bodies were discovered. All 3 torsos were weighed down with rocks, and their heads were wrapped in plastic bags, secured tightly with duct tape. It was a chilling scene. Using dental records, DNA, and clothing, the authorities confirmed the identities of the bodies. It was William Muller, his wife Nancy, and their 8-year-old daughter Sarah. What had started as a missing persons case had quickly turned into a brutal triple homicide investigation. When the coroner examined the bodies, they concluded that they'd probably been in the water since January 11th, the last day anyone had seen them. But there was more to the story. The investigators found tiny specks of blue paint stuck to the tape. They sent the paint samples to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. for testing, and it was confirmed that the paint matched the type used on General Motors vehicles. With this new lead, investigators pieced together that 2 people must have been involved. One drove the blue car with the bodies, while the other followed in the Muller's Jeep. By the time the bodies were dumped in the water, the Mullers were likely already dead, suffocated by the plastic bags. The investigation soon turned back to the Mullers' belongings. Since the family had vanished, most of their valuables had been taken by relatives, but some items had been left behind, stored in their landlord's garage. Among the things found were a Colt .45 gun case with a serial number, but the gun was missing. They also found a family photo with some friends. The team entered the gun's serial number into the National Crime Information Center database, and bingo. The gun had been traced to a man named Travis Brake, who had been arrested months earlier in Seattle, Washington, for carrying a concealed weapon. He admitted that he'd bought the handgun at a gun show and described 2 men he had bought it from. One of the men stood out to him. Investigators showed Brake the photo they found among the Mullers' belongings, and Brake pointed to one of the men, Kirby Kehoe. If you remember, this was the same man who had robbed the Mullers a year prior, and this guy was no stranger to trouble. He had a long criminal history involving firearms and was heavily involved in the white supremacist movement. However, the investigators still needed solid evidence before they could make an arrest. Nearly a year after the Mullers' murder, investigators got a break in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. A trooper spotted a blue Chevy Suburban with suspicious bumper stickers parked in a handicapped spot. Inside, Sean Haynes and his pregnant girlfriend were found asleep. The trooper ran the serial numbers on 2 guns Haynes had in the vehicle and discovered one, a stolen AR-15 rifle, had belonged to the Mullers. Arrested and questioned, Haynes admitted he had traded another firearm for the rifle at a Washington motel 6 months earlier. The trader? Chevy Kehoe, Kirby Kehoe's eldest son. At this point, the investigators had 2 suspects, but before we dive deeper into the case, let's take a moment to understand the background of the Kehoe family. Trust me, knowing their story will shed light on why they did what they did. Now, the Kehoe family was nothing like the Mullers. Chevy Kehoe, 26 years old, grew up in a household where white supremacy wasn't just talked about, it was their way of life. Chevy wasn't your average troubled young man. His father's influence shaped everything, steering the family down a dark and hateful path. When Chevy was just a baby, the Kehoes packed their bags and left sunny Florida for the quiet hills of Madison County, North Carolina. Fast forward to the mid-'80s. The Kehoes moved again, this time to Stevens County in Washington. Initially, Chevy seemed like a bright kid with potential. He was an honor student at Colville Junior High School, but by 1988, his parents decided to homeschool him. Their reasoning? They wanted to provide more focused attention. But instead of fostering a healthy learning environment, they created a bubble of radical ideas. From a young age, he was pushed into a life of crime, learning robbery, theft, and how to fight off the cops. As you can imagine, the Kehoe home was a breeding ground for hate and paranoia. Anti-government beliefs were their bread and butter, and Chevy soaked it all up. He wasn't just a kid with big dreams. His dreams were violent, dangerous, and fueled by white supremacy. By the time he was a young man, Chevy had one goal: to overthrow the U.S. government and create his own white supremacist utopia, something he called the Aryan People's Republic. This wasn't just a phase. For Chevy, this twisted vision was everything, and his family were the foundation for his dangerous ideology. You could see this influence clearly in 1995, when Chevy took part in a violent kidnapping and robbery. In June of that year, he and a partner targeted Malcolm and Jill Friedman, a Jewish couple who owned a store where Chevy had once worked. The Friedmans were held at gunpoint, but this wasn't just a random crime. Chevy specifically went after them because of their ethnicity. This act was a clear reflection of the hate and violence he'd been raised to embrace. With everything going on, it was no surprise that both Kirby Kehoe and his son, Chevy Kehoe, had been on police radars for years. If Chevy was involved in all kinds of crimes, just imagine the trouble his father, Kirby, had been up to. But here's the kicker. Despite the long history of criminal activity, both of them were nowhere to be found. No one could track them down, and they seemed to vanish into thin air. That is, until February 15, 1977, when a state trooper in Ohio pulled over a blue Chevy Suburban. The car had been swerving, driving way too slowly, and just looked suspicious. While passing by, the driver didn't even glance at the trooper, but the passenger gave him a nod. The officer thought nothing of it until he realized the passenger kept staring at him through the rearview mirror, even after they passed him by. That was when the officer's instincts started kicking in. They ran the license plate and found that it had expired. To top it off, neither of them had valid driver's licenses. When the trooper asked the driver to get out of the vehicle, the guy complied, but warned the officer not to touch him. Then things took a turn. One of the deputies called for a tow truck to impound the vehicle, and that's when the driver suddenly bolted back to the car. The officers chased after him, but as they tried to subdue him, the guy who was sitting in the passenger seat pulled out a handgun and started firing at the officers, creating enough chaos for Chevy to jump back into the Suburban and make a break for it.
Asked the driver to step out of the car. The man told the officer he borrowed the truck from a friend. He then refused to a pat-down search. Listen as the officer attempts to search the man for weapons.
Any guns, knives, clubs, stuff like that on here, sir?
I don't want you going and searching through all my stuff.
I'm not searching through your stuff, sir. I'm going to put you in my car.
Oh, that's just fine, but
Now, do you have any guns, knives, clubs, or stuff like that on you? Very good.
Listen, sir, I don't want no problems.
I'm not going to give you any problems, sir.
Apparently, he did want problems. A few more minutes went by. Then the man ran back to his car in an attempt to get away. The passenger then opened fire on the police.
Please!
As the passenger ran into the woods, the driver sped away.
By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Turns out, the two men in that intense standoff were Chevy Kehoe and his brother, Cheney Kehoe. When Chevy took off in the Suburban, Cheney, who was in the passenger seat, bolted into the nearby woods. The cops spent the entire day searching for him, but as you might expect, they couldn't catch him. Now, just like Chevy, Cheney was also deeply embedded in white supremacy, and he wasn't afraid to use violence to push his beliefs. Later that day, Chevy found himself involved in another shootout, this time in the parking lot of an electrical supply company. He exchanged gunfire with two Wilmington police officers, Officer Richard Rick Wood and Sergeant Robert Bob Martin. During the chaos, an innocent bystander, 56-year-old Frank Marsden, was hit in the shoulder. The shootout was captured on the dash cameras of both the trooper and the sergeant, and it quickly became a major story. The footage was aired in 1997 on Fox's World's Scariest Police Shootouts and became a hit, showing up on other programs like Most Shocking and World's Most Amazing Videos. Meanwhile, the Kehoe brothers were on the run, traveling in secret with their families across multiple states in an RV. Investigators feared they'd stop at nothing to escape, and the police had to step up their efforts. They spread out images of the brothers, hoping someone would recognize them or the vehicle. At Lake Hill Campground, investigators discovered that the Kehoes had camped there in an RV, but they were 2 days too late. The RV had already left. Days turned into weeks, and sightings of the RV kept pouring in from across the country. They had been spotted in places like West Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, Texas, and Montana, always just one step ahead of the law. In Indianapolis, the stolen van with Chevy's signature gas receipt was found, but there was no sign of Cheney. A few days later, the Kehoe's RV was found abandoned on a desolate stretch of road in Wyoming. When the police checked it out, they discovered a disturbing stash: guns, ammunition, fake FBI jackets, U.S. Marshals badges, and a box full of bomb-making materials. The ATF bomb squad was called in to inspect, and although they didn't find any live devices, the components made it clear the Kehoes were preparing for something far worse. Authorities were deeply concerned about the brothers' growing violence and what they might do next. As the search continued, it seemed like the Kehoes were always one step ahead. But then, on June 16, 1997, investigators received a tip. Cheney Kehoe, Chevy's brother, was ready to turn himself in. Cheney revealed where he and his brother had been hiding for the past few months, and authorities learned that after the shootouts in Ohio, they had taken refuge on a remote ranch in southern Utah. The owners had given them room and board in exchange for help on the farm. But things had gone south quickly when Chevy's temper flared and his paranoia grew. Chevy even spoke about killing his wife, Karina, who had Native American ancestry, and plotting to murder his own parents, Kirby and Gloria, to raise his younger brothers in his white supremacist vision. Then, on June 12th, Chevy's paranoia turned against his own brother. After a violent argument, Cheney feared for his life and the safety of his family. He decided to flee with his loved ones in the middle of the night, driving nearly 1,000 miles back to Washington State, and that ended their long time running. Chevy Kehoe was arrested on June 17, 1997. But that's not the most important part. The most interesting and important thing Cheney told law enforcement is that Chevy confessed to being involved in the murder of the Mullers with another unnamed male. Additionally, around that time, in June of 1997, Kirby Kehoe, the father of the Kehoe brothers, was also arrested. Now, as you can imagine, the arrest of the father didn't exactly fit the narrative everyone was expecting. He wasn't involved with the Muller family's murder, nor was Cheney Kehoe. But just when the situation seemed to be unraveling, Gloria Kehoe, Chevy's mother, stepped forward to law enforcement and dropped a bombshell. Gloria revealed that her son, Chevy, had confessed to her about the horrifying details of the Muller family slaying. She went on to explain that the murders weren't just some spontaneous act, they were planned out for a whole year. The plan went way back to the first robbery of the Muller family back in February of 1995, which had apparently set everything in motion. According to Gloria, the chain of events started when William Muller, the patriarch of the Muller family, confronted Kirby Kehoe after suspecting him of being involved in the robbery. Apparently, during this confrontation, William Muller was incredibly disrespectful to Kirby, which did not sit well with Chevy. In fact, it seemed to be the moment that flipped a switch in Chevy's mind. He thought that William's disrespect was enough to give him the green light to go ahead and rob and kill the Mullers. But there was more to it than just a grudge over disrespect. According to law enforcement, Chevy's motivation wasn't just personal. He had found out that William Muller was in possession of some serious weaponry, expensive firearms, high-end gear, and ammunition, and that piqued Chevy's interest even more. Gloria didn't stop there. She named a second man involved in the murders, Daniel Lewis Lee. Lee wasn't a stranger to Chevy. He was someone Chevy knew through their involvement in white supremacy groups. Both Chevy and Lee were heavily invested in the idea of creating a whites-only nation, and they were bound by their shared ideology. Together, they had planned to rob the Mullers, kill them, and cover up their tracks to avoid implicating themselves or Kirby in the crime. Gloria went on to explain that on January 11, 1996, the Muller family had left for a gun show. While they were gone, Chevy and Lee dressed up as law enforcement officers and made their way to the Muller home. When the Mullers returned, Chevy and Lee ambushed them, tying them up. But there was one part of the plan that didn't go as expected. According to Gloria, Lee was hesitant, especially when it came to killing Sarah Muller, the Muller family's daughter. Apparently, Lee just couldn't bring himself to do it, so Chevy took matters into his own hands and killed Sarah himself. Fast forward to March of 1999, and Daniel Lewis Lee and Chevy Kehoe stood trial for the triple murder. Both Cheney and Gloria Kehoe testified against them, spilling the details of what had happened. The trial ended with a conviction. Chevy Kehoe was sentenced to life in prison, while Daniel Lewis Lee was sentenced to death. Apparently, Daniel Lewis Lee also had a deeply troubled upbringing, one that was marked by instability and violence. From a young age, Lee faced significant challenges. He struggled with seizures and other neurological issues that often led him to be placed in mental health facilities. However, his time in these facilities was short-lived, as he was removed due to his violent behavior. His struggles were compounded by his inability to control his anger and his growing propensity for violence, which only seemed to escalate as he got older. By the time Lee was 17, his violent tendencies had already manifested in a chilling way. He was involved in the brutal murder of Joseph Wavra, which occurred during a robbery. It was the third murder in a string of violent crimes, but incredibly, Lee managed to avoid a murder charge. Instead, he received only a suspended sentence for the robbery, a decision that seemed more lenient than it should have been, given the severity of the crime. Unfortunately, this leniency did little to curb Lee's violent impulses. It only appeared to embolden him, allowing his thirst for violence to grow unchecked. It wasn't long before Lee crossed paths with Chevy Kehoe. The two met in 1995, and their shared hatred for the government and their twisted desire to establish a white supremacist stronghold brought them together. Now, Lee tried to soften his image in court, claiming he had a good side and that he could change. It felt a bit ridiculous, though. His past was full of violent acts. His plea for mercy sounded more like a movie redemption arc than reality. The court didn't buy it. Lee's past was too ugly, and no one believed he could really change. In the end, he was executed by lethal injection in 2020.
For the first time in 17 years, a federal prison inmate was executed this morning. Daniel Lewis Lee received a lethal injection in Indiana after the U.S. Supreme Court allowed the execution to proceed. He was convicted of murdering 3 members of an Arkansas family back in 1996, including an 8-year-old girl. Lee told witnesses this morning, though, that he didn't do it. The High Court, with conservative justices in the majority, voted 5-4 overnight to reverse the lower court rulings. Those courts had been concerned with what they called an unconstitutional risk of pain when it comes to lethal injection.
Despite being the mastermind behind the brutal murders of the Muller family, Chevy Kehoe managed to escape the death penalty, while Daniel Lewis Lee, who had a less direct role, was sentenced to death. This didn't seem to make sense. How could the guy who planned and carried out the whole thing get a lighter sentence than his partner in crime? But what made things even crazier was that Chevy was involved in another huge crime, the Oklahoma City bombing. After Chevy was arrested, his brother Cheney claimed Chevy knew about the bombing before it happened. Apparently, Chevy was seen with Timothy McVeigh, the bomber, at a motel in Spokane months before the bombing. The manager of that motel even said that Chevy had been excited about the bombing when the news hit and had even hinted that something big was going to happen on April 19th. Yet, when the FBI looked into it, they couldn't find any proof that McVeigh had ever been in Spokane or that Chevy had any direct involvement in the bombing. Chevy denied everything, but the rumors just added to the mystery. It was clear that Chevy had ties to violent extremist groups, and yet he still got off easy compared to Lee. At the end, Cheney Kehoe received a 24-year sentence for attempted murder and weapons possession due to his role in an Ohio shootout, while their father, Kirby Kehoe, was sentenced to 44 months after pleading guilty to federal racketeering charges. Later, Cheney's sentence was reduced to 11 years, and he was released from prison in 2008. But Cheney's trouble with the law didn't end there. On October 14, 2013, he and Kirby were arrested by federal officials in Arizona after an ATF raid uncovered a large marijuana growing operation and an arsenal of weapons at an off-grid compound. Authorities seized 17 firearms, nearly 17,000 rounds of ammunition, 15 pounds of marijuana, and various pieces of body armor. Both Cheney and Kirby pleaded guilty to being felons in possession of firearms and ammunition in 2014. Cheney was sentenced to 41 months in prison, while Kirby received a 10-year sentence. Cheney was released in September 2016, and Kirby followed in January 2022. As for Chevy, he spent much of his time at the United States Penitentiary, Florence ADX in Colorado, under the Federal Bureau of Prisons Register number 21300-009. He was later transferred to several different prisons, including United States Penitentiary, Florence High, and United States Penitentiary, McCreary in Kentucky. By 2022, Chevy Kehoe was being held at the United States Penitentiary, Terre Haute, and one can only hope that he's suffering there more than his victims did. But what do you think about all this? Do you believe justice was served, or do you think the law went too easy on them, especially considering their anti-government beliefs? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.